On a full moon night, Oscar team came to a bustling city. But the streets were deserted, the doors and windows of every house were closed, and the whole city was quiet, as if asleep. A bright full moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the streets like daylight. There is an abandoned mansion in the city. It is said that every full moon night, the ghost in the mansion will appear. On this night, as long as you enter the mansion, meet the ghost, and agree to help him work in the garden, you will be trapped forever. Oscar narrated the story and asked everyone not to run around. Nils was curious as to whether there were any ghosts in the world. When Oscar wasn't paying attention, he quietly slipped out of the wild geese and found the door of the mansion along the street. It looked desolate, with the surrounding walls covered with green moss, and tangled ancient vines stretching around the wall into the yard. Occasionally, a few crows would quack on the top floor of the mansion. The whole building exudes an eerie atmosphere. The fragrance of flowers wafted from the yard. Neil unconsciously reached the fence gate and stretched his nose to smell it. Suddenly, a big pale hand grabbed him. Neil was startled. This was a gardener with a pale face. He had no expression, and only the corners of his mouth moved slightly when he spoke. He made a stern voice and said to Neil, "Come in and visit. All the flowers I planted are in bloom." The yard was a beautiful garden. Bunches of tulips were swaying in the wind, and bright red roses gave off a strong floral fragrance. Neil went up to touch them, but was accidentally pricked by a small thorn. There is a pool in the center of the yard. The water in the pool is rippling blue, and some petals are falling in the water. Nils followed the gardener, and suddenly found that there was no reflection of him in the pool. Is he a ghost? Nils thought uneasily. Neil was frightened and began to walk back quietly, but before he could run far, the gardener stood in front of Neil. He held a big shovel in his hand and said, "Such a beautiful garden. You want to try loosening the soil for flowers?" Neil had an idea and said, "This shovel is too big. Can you change it to a smaller one?" The gardener said, "Okay, I'll change it. You can wait for me in the mansion." Neil was curious about the mansion. What will be there? So he mustered up the courage and walked in. Neil carefully slipped in through the crack in the door, only to hear the whistling wind making the window creak. The shadows on the curtains looked like devils with teeth and claws, and the large chandelier on the ceiling was covered with spider webs. The light flickered on and off, which was extremely scary. But curiosity drove Neil up the high stairs. The ground was covered with thick dust. Suddenly, a creepy singing sound sounded. Are ghosts singing? Neil trembled at the thought. He was so frightened that he could hardly move. At this time, a pale old lady appeared in front of him. She was wearing a white gauze shawl. Her smiling face was covered with wrinkles, and she looked very scary. Neil was startled. He closed his eyes tightly and didn't know what to do. When he mustered up the courage to look up again, he discovered that it was just a painting hanging on the wall at the top of the stairs. Neil walked gently up to the second floor, where an old rocking chair swayed on the empty floor as if it would never stop. The white curtains fluttered in the wind. Suddenly, when Neil saw the ghost painting hanging on the wall, he finally couldn't hold on any longer. Fear defeated his curiosity, and he turned around and ran out of the mansion quickly. Just as Neil was escaping through the garden, he met the gardener again. "This is the small shovel you asked for. Now you can loosen the soil in the garden. It only takes a few strokes," the gardener said and handed over the small shovel. Neil took it hesitantly. At this time, an owl flapped its wings and flew out from the window on the second floor of the mansion, and said above their heads, "Sorry, my singing has disturbed you. However, I have to admit, my singing is really beautiful." Then he flapped his wings and flew away triumphantly. It turned out that the singing was not that of a ghost, and Neil felt less scared. However, he was also a little tired and wanted to leave here, so he said to the gardener, "I still have some friends. I think they will be happy to help you work in the garden. I will go find them. You can wait for me here." The gardener lowered his head sadly and said feebly, "Just help me." Neil looked at the gardener's sad expression and felt a little sympathetic. But when he thought about Oscar's story, he was afraid that he would really be left in this garden forever. When the gardener wasn't paying attention, he quickly rushed outside the garden gate. The gardener hurriedly ran to the gate and grabbed the iron railing. He looked at Neil outside and said frustratedly, "No one is helping me. I don't want to stay here forever." After that, he turned into a ball of white smoke and disappeared into the air. Neil returned to the wild geese. He excitedly told everyone what had just happened, and everyone was scared and leaned together. When the moon disappeared from the horizon, the wild geese flew away in a hurry.